studies at Georgetown. And he is the author of a new book, Crucibles of Power, Smolensk under Soviet and Nazi Rule. This book has a predecessor of 70 years ago, Smolensk under Soviet rule by Murderous, who was director for quite a while of the Russian Research Center at Harvard, died many years ago, I think in the early 70s. And he had access to what was called the Smolensk Archive at that point, a set of captured, as Michael will tell, and I don't want to preempt it, but just to say that that was located here at Harvard initially. The Smolensk Archive was transferred to the Russian Research Center for use to study what Soviet rule was like. It was a set of documents captured during the Second World War and by the Germans and then by the U.S. Forces. And that was also the subject of a much later book, and I think it was in the late 90s, by Evgeny Kodin, who was here actually for a while. I remember him when he was here, and I think it was around that time or a little bit before, because he was working with the materials that were still here, and then put out a book that I think is called Smolensk Archive, Amerikanskaya Sovietologia, the Smolensk Archive and American Sovietology. It wasn't the most flattering book on earth, but he was also worked as he was primarily at Smolensk State University, I think, and then worked as an archivist for a while, and so he was some of what he was involved in the new book by Michael David Fox. But the book looks back at some of the same topics that were covered by a book that we had presented here in April by, I think it was in April, by Laszlo Borty, that looked at choices that people make under occupation by tyrannical outside powers, by Nazis and Soviet forces in this case. And that was also true of Laszlo Borty's book. And I found, comparing the two books, that they address some of the same important questions, but in much different contexts. Hungary and Soviet Union, or Western Soviet Union. So let me also introduce, as a commentator today after Michael will speak for about 35 minutes, and then we will have a commentary of 15 minutes or so by Serhiy Plokhy, who is my colleague here for quite a few years. He is a professor, I think Crucibles Professor of History of Ukrainian History at Harvard, and he also, until very recently, a couple of months ago, was director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. He stepped down from there after 12 years, but it's still very formidable presence there. So he will offer a commentary on the book, and then we will open out for discussion. So with that, Michael, please.
Thank you so much. First of all, Mark, for inviting me here. I'm particularly grateful to Serhiy Plokhy for, I know he's off to Ukraine in a few days and on sabbatical. So for coming to this and doing the commentary. I also should say that in the course of my research, I spent about 300 days in Smolensk, and Evgeny Kodin was the rector of the university at that time. He wrote many books on Smolensk. So all of his students were the archivists there. So he was a big figure in the footnotes of this book. I'm going to start with a couple of maps, not because geography is destiny, but because even here at Harvard, where the Smolensk Archive was, and where Merle Feinsod was one of the greatest Sovietologists of the 20th century, taught for many years, you may not know where Smolensk is. And I say that because this book is not about the city of Smolensk, which is now in the westernmost part of the Russian Federation, and which many people do know, but it's about the Smolensk region or the oblast. And as you can see from this map, where exactly the Smolensk region is not that intuitive, because in precisely the period that I'm studying, which is the period from the 1920s through the German occupation, the Smolensk region underwent some of the most radical territorial transformations that it had in its long history. It was, Smolensk was an ancient garrison town in the early modern period, as he knows extremely well. It was also a gubernia or a province in the early 19th century. But you can see basically this dark region is the darkest region of this map is essentially the Smolensk region as it was after World War II and is today, pretty much almost exactly the same borders. This slightly less dark region, the two darkest regions here, is essentially what I studied in both the 1920s, when it was roughly right around this, and also after the re-Sovietization of 1943, when the Soviets came back in after over 2 years of German occupation. So these two darkest regions are the area I studied most intensively. But what you can see in this largest region, this is giant Western Oblast or Western region with its capital in Smolensk. That was the capital, that was the region from 1929 to 1937. So the largest, and that corresponds exactly to the Stalin period. So space and power, territory and power were one of the biggest a big theme in my book. And what we can see is that this initial first phase of the Stalin Revolution involved the biggest territorial administrative change in Smolensk region's history. So this larger region had a population of just over 6 million. The smaller region had a population, about 2.3 million. So the population, it was a largely rural region. It's sparsely populated, but in terms of geography and territory, it's vast. The smallest region, which it is today, is roughly twice the size of Belgium. So I was saying when I gave a talk in Seoul that it's about half the size of South Korea. So it's not small. I worked with a great historical cartographer on this book, and incredibly, she found that aside from this map that she made of the Western region from the 1930s, the only other significant extant map was one old Soviet one, and the one that is in the beginning or the cover of Merle Feinsad's classic work, Smolensk Under Soviet Rule. So this was a work that was absolutely foundational for US-Soviet studies, in part because, as Mark mentioned, this captured Smolensk Archive, which was transported first by the Germans west and then captured by the Americans and brought to the US and was here at Harvard after 1951. So first it was poured over by the intelligence agencies, but it was the only authentic Communist Party documentation available in the West during the Cold War. And this was known as the Smolensk Archive, but it was quite fragmentary. So no one really knows. And Patricia Grimstead studied the Odyssey of the Smolensk Archive in incredible detail. But at some point near Auschwitz, the Soviets recaptured, the Germans kept transporting it west as the Soviets marched west. The something like 2% of the archive was separated and made it to Germany, and the rest was recaptured by the Soviets and brought back to Smolensk and Moscow. So the Smolensk archive that we knew during the Cold War was about 2% of the overall documentation. And so, you know, but many generations of historians and Sovietologists poured over those archives, and a lot was written based on those fragmentary archives. And when, you know, after 1991, when the archives opened up and it was possible to study anything, Smolensk was the one region where almost no one went because they thought, well, we already know. But in fact, so my idea was to study the other 98% as well, at least have access to them. And one of the things that the Smolensk archive petered out during the Great Terror right around 1937. So I wanted to study the late 30s, two regime changes, 1941 when the Germans came in and occupied it and created a new regime, and then the re-Sovietization in late 1943. So two regime changes in 3 years is kind of a laboratory for the historian of power relations. And because those Smolensk files also became deeply embedded into the US field of Soviet studies, in a way, revisiting Smolensk was a journey through the history of the field as well. So my idea was to look at the Stalin period, starting in the late 20s, look at the cataclysms that occurred, collectivization, the Great Terror, but then look at part of a same history, the German occupation and the Holocaust, and then carry it through the other change of regime in 1943. So I was doing what I called a new type of entangled history. Instead of just looking at Stalinism or Soviet history or World War II or the Holocaust or National Socialism, I was trying to look at them all in one frame and to leverage the juxtapositions, the analytical purchase that could be gained from juxtaposing and studying the interactions. And I also used German, Wehrmacht sources, which are military archive in Freiburg. And so each chapter involves both a Soviet and a German side. Now, to get back to the territorial aspect, the main topic of the book is power and power relations, which was also the topic that Feensad studied as a political scientist. And it was absolutely not coincidental, as Stalin might have said, that the two greatest territorial changes in Smolensk region history occurred in those key dates, 1929, the outset of the Stalin Revolution, and 1937, the Great Terror, because that was a chance to change cadres, power relations, bureaucracies, and to reorganize the whole territory. So in 1929, Rumyantsev, who was the first secretary of the Smolensk Party organization, came to power, and he was purged in 1937 along with his whole entourage and network. And so he was the original little Stalin, is the phrase that Feensad first used. Subnational dictator is the political science phrase that we would use today. But more than that, Smolensk was in a way close to Moscow because it was, it's now 4.5 hours by train. It was longer in the 30s, but it was also far from Moscow in that it was very rural and definitely outside the Moscow region. So in a way, Smolensk region, in ways that I discovered, became a model for the Stalin regime to experiment. First in the so-called Smolensk affair, which was a kind of outset of Stalinism and outset of collectivizing agriculture in the late 1920s, and then during the Great Terror. Things happened there slightly earlier or experimentally that happened in the rest of the Soviet Union. So my book also discards this simple dichotomy of kind of center-periphery relations. I'm looking at levels of power: center, region, and local, district and local. And I'm looking at the same type of hierarchy of power, levels of power, when I study the German occupation, and there's some similarities there. And I found that at all the great turning points of Stalinism, the entrenched relations of those levels of power were completely upended. That Stalin used the local and district levels against the middle, the regional levels, both in his Great Break of 29 and the Great Terror of 37. So the levels of power are also really crucial for the kind of feedback loop that the Germans had, which became quite fateful in the history of the Holocaust and the Einsatzgruppen in World War II, between what's happening on the ground in the occupation and what the masters in Berlin are perceiving and ordering. So this yellow part is the Smolensk region of the 30s that I was studying. But of course, under the Germans, that territory had Soviet regions had no meaning. What the Wehrmacht was administering behind the front lines, this entire area that was close to the front lines. It was under military rule, military administration, as opposed to the Reich commissariats, which were, in Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics. Now, one of the reasons I wrote this book is that this is where Father Patrick Desbois wrote a book called The Holocaust by Bullets, where he went and did interviews with survivors and found unmarked graves in the Holocaust. And he had gone into the Smolensk region and done many interviews with people who were essentially children and teenagers at the time. And he found very interesting stuff. So that was one of the reasons also I wanted to study this. But if you see this arrow that's heading towards Moscow, right? This is going straight through Minsk and Smolensk, then Moscow. This is precisely the route of the German invasion that went along the highway that Stalin had built with Gulag forced labor by a traveling Gulag camp in the mid-1930s. This was the Minsk-Moscow highway. And it was one of the reasons why more than, the vast bulk of German divisions, something like 40% of the German divisions went through Army Group Center. And half the tanks, but also the sheer concentration of high-level Wehrmacht and SS forces headquartered in Smolensk during the war was due to the fact that it was on the road to Moscow, which they never took, of course, but they were planning to purge thoroughly. And if you look at this vast territory that the Germans controlled, without massive help from armed and unarmed collaborators, the Germans could have never held on to their forces were at the front lines. So they had collaborators, including armed collaborators in the rear areas and civilian administrations. And so without collaborators, this whole occupation would not have worked. I mean, the Germans were occupying a territory, if you include all the regions they occupied, over 68 million people. That's 40% of the pre-war Soviet population. So my idea was to just put these fields together, but also to look at the local and the regional levels of power in a way that a book like, let's say, Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which was a sweeping synthesis and based on about 8 or 10 languages, it simply could not go into that kind of depth. Because what I think is at the grassroots, the place that the local and the regional meets the grand narrative is actually a crucial place to study. So Hitler and Stalin are still a constant presence in this book, even though they never met the main characters. And that's the last element of the book that I'm going to talk about, is the element of biography and autobiography and individual lives, because the book has about 10 main characters and many cameo appearances by other figures. And what I really wanted to study in putting all this together, as Mark alluded to, was the element of decision-making in extreme circumstances, in the depths of the 20th century, in extreme conditions. How do people make choices? How do they make decisions? Do they have some sort of agency? And I think that studying regimes or systems alone sort of limits our understanding of both Stalinism and Nazism, because that can't really show how power and power relations were manifested in the lives of ordinary people. And they might not even be ordinary people, but local notables and people important on the local and regional levels. And what I found, and this speaks to our own day, I think, when we have, rising authoritarianisms around the world, is that there were many people who were, of course, victims, but many victims also could become perpetrators, sometimes at the same time. But also there was a whole group of people who saw in the cataclysm a chance to do something differently in their lives, either to realize some opportunity that they had been held back from before. But for many of them, it also involved power. And I think it involved seizing a slice of power for themselves in this broader catastrophe. And I think, both regimes of far right and far left not only allowed this locals to seize this slice of power, but in both of them actually required some locals to do that, to function as they did. So of the characters, I'm just going to be able to give you a kind of taste of I'm going to give you just 3 of the interesting figures who I intersperse. Their biographies, are interspersed throughout the chapters. I was going to say that choice and decision-making, it's studied across social sciences, human sciences, economists, psychologists, neurobiologists. What do historians have to bring to the table? Well, we know what their entire life trajectory looks like in the cases of the people that I studied. And we can then retrospectively see what kind of the turning points seem to be as we study those biographies. And one thing I found, this is one of the main characters of the book, Boris Vereshchagin, who was the mayor of the city of Smolensk under German occupation. And he's sitting here. There's a portrait of Adolf Hitler here. His Wehrmacht Minder is here. These are members of his local collaborationist, administration. But his activities under the Stalin period bear an uncanny resemblance to his activities under the German occupation. Before he became the occupation-era mayor of Smolensk, he was a defense attorney during the regional show trials of the 1930s. Now, under the Great Terror, the defense attorneys basically were arms of the prosecution. They were often, sometimes to the chagrin of some of the jurists like Wyszynski, actually more zealous than the prosecutors, because they didn't want to defend people who had been accused in show trials. What Vereshchagin did was he became famous by actually defending some local technical specialists, veterinarians who had been accused of some outlandish fabricated crimes. He traveled to Moscow and he managed to actually get a few people let off from one of the show trials. And this made him famous in Smolensk. But in all other respects, except for that, which he did rather more cautiously than he let on, but he still did do this. He outwardly subordinated himself to the Stalin regime, which actually needed him to act in the role that he acted. So he did that, but he thought of himself as more cultured, more moral. He was a religious believer his whole life, which was one reason he went over to the Nazis. And he did the same under the German occupation. So he managed to save some Jewish citizens, some POWs, but in all other respects, and he surreptitiously did what he could to protect the local population. He was a technocrat, not an ideologue, but he also played a role in upholding the system. But he also became, especially during the occupation, incredibly powerful when he was looking down. When he was looking up, he was entirely subordinate to the Germans officially. But when he looked down, he had the power of life and death over the local population. So he too gained a measure of power as a result of the war. And his life illustrates something I call biographical logics, which is to exactly what I've been saying about historians can perhaps illuminate about the key turning points and kind of logical progressions in people's lives under these types of regimes. We can't write about these people without writing about their autobiographical writings. And this was actually a story I probably don't have time to tell, but Menshagin, because he had witnessed the Katyn massacre, which the Stalinists blamed on the Germans, but had really been carried out by Beria in 1940, he was kept alive, unlike major occupation mayors who would have been simply shot, and he was put in prison for 25 years. He wrote extensive notebooks, which were later, and he managed to meet several dissidents in the 1960s. And when he was released in 1971, the KGB kept the notebooks, but he had a phenomenal memory. It was like an incredible, and we verified these memoirs in so many different ways. Sometimes he forgot a date or a fact, but he reconstructed them by memory at the dacha of a dissident. They were smuggled out on cassette, and I was one part of the editorial team. This book here that I'm showing you is like over 800 pages long. This one is only about 400. So in any case, that was his annotated memoirs. We put out a critical edition in 2019 in Russian, and nothing like that had been seen from a wartime mayor. So the point I want to make, finishing up on Menshagin, is that past choices bias future decisions. And that's true for many, many figures in my book. The second person I'll briefly mention, this is the only picture of her that I could find, and you can see she's a school child in the 1930s. Her name is Lyudmila Madzyuk. She's the opposite of Menshagin. Instead of becoming a collaborator, she formed the first underground Communist Party resistance cell in occupied Smolensk. And you can see from this photo that she was part of the so-called 1930s generation, the generation that had never experienced anything before 1917. And she acted in a typical way. She was a member of the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League. She was studying aviation to become an aviation engineer in Moscow. When the Germans invaded, she dropped everything. She volunteered to become a nurse, went with the Red Army to the front, was captured in encirclement, could not get back across the Soviet lines. She was imprisoned several times. She teamed up with another Komsomolka, another young woman who was actually Jewish, another figure in my book, Asya Schneiderman. And everyone else was abandoning her because of her Jewishness. Lyudmila helped her. They banded together. Somehow they ended up in a POW camp outside of Smolensk. And when women and children were released from that camp, they were both given residency papers in occupied Smolensk. And Schneiderman managed to conceal her Jewishness throughout the war. She's later left for the partisans. But in any case, they smuggled food to the Jewish ghetto in the city of Smolensk, and also food to the Gulag, which was a POW, essentially starvation camp, which I will talk about presently. So compared with Menshagin, her reaction was the polar opposite. She risked her life for the Soviet cause. She also left some of the most insightful autobiographical statements I found about a taboo topic, relations between local Russian women and German soldiers, which is the topic of sexual violence, but also the spectrum of relationships that emerged in occupied Smolensk. It's the topic of an entire chapter here. So what does her case say about biographical logics? She hated the fact, she spoke German, by the way, and managed to propagandize Germans in their canteens, and actually managed to persuade some German soldiers to defect to the partisans, which is incredible. And she studied Karl Marx's Kapital with a former communist Wehrmacht soldier named Leo. So this image of the Komsomolka Lucia and the German Wehrmacht soldier Leo studying Marx in occupied Smolensk shows you the kind of strange situations that can emerge. But the fascist version of the gender order is one of the biggest differences between the two ideologies. When the Germans talked to her, they said, well, in Germany, you do great. You could maybe become a secretary. You're literate. So she hated this and the acquisitiveness of the Germans. And so she actually, after the war, achieved her dream to become not an aviation engineer, but she became an applied chemist. But she achieved that dream far from Moscow in the Komi Republic, because her father was purged. But she became a specialist at one of the energy combinats in a position of authority. So this also shows that post-war biographical trajectories were all influenced by the war. And she died in 2002 at the age of 81. Now, the last person I want to talk about, how much time do I have left? About 5 minutes? I can go on. Okay. So I don't have a picture of this man because he was a peasant, and I wanted someone from the rural population, right, to represent the lives of so many millions. He was a highly unusual peasant because he became literate. Vasily Maslenikov, who's someone who is neither chose the Germans nor chose the resistance, but he was someone who was fundamentally buffeted by events, and pure chance determined much of his life trajectory. In fact, his father was a horse, was tending horses at the Corps de Cadet in Moscow before the revolution. And so he was growing up as a child as a stable hand in Moscow, but he somehow taught himself to read any scrap of newspaper he could get. He taught himself to read, and that actually determined much of his life, because then in the revolution, there was street fighting in Moscow in 1917, and collateral damage, completely destroyed the home and food supply of his father, and they had to go back to their home village in Smolensk, where he was raised by his grandfather, who one book was the Bible, and he thought the Bolsheviks were devils. And there were 6 churches in the village and no schools, but he had learned how to read before going back to this village in Smolensk. And somehow, despite this incredible kaleidoscope he later hated collectivization, but the only way to escape the village was to join the collectivizers. He did not want to live on the collective farm. So he became a party member, but a reluctant one. He became an official, a minor official on the collective farm. He struggled his whole life to leave his home village, but somehow fate always brought him back to the same area. And the other thing is that 2 of his siblings, they had exactly the same background. They were peasants who were trying to get out of the village by climbing the ladder of the Soviet educational system. But the Soviet system controlled life choices very closely. And so he kept trying, kept failing. Finally, he achieved his dream of becoming a teacher in a small town, not a village. And then, like a month later, the Germans invaded. So he had to go back to his family in his home village. He was known as a party member, so the Germans would have known that. So he kind of reluctantly was almost coerced into joining the partisans. And he was captured by the Germans, became an Ostarbeiter, an Eastern laborer in Saxony, and came back after the war and to face this incredible stigma because he had lived in the land of fascism. But his siblings had opposite fates. His brother actually was handicapped, but he knew some German, so he was forced to become a translator for the Germans, and then was labeled a collaborator. His sister, similar background, became an agent of Smolensk, so the secret police that was purging the region after the Soviets came back. So 3 siblings from the same family, 3 different fates entirely. So he was buffeted by events, but at one fateful moment, he was captured by the Germans. He was put in a Gulag or a Durchganglager. You can see here Gulag 240. That was a POW camp. And this was one of the greatest atrocities, even greater in numbers on Soviet territory than the Holocaust. Up to 3.3 million Soviet POWs died of starvation, disease, and shooting and other forced marches, forced transportation like this one. Here's another picture of the Gulag in near Smolensk. And, because it's not a genocide, right? Because it's a war crime. These are people in the multi-ethnic Red Army who are not one ethnic group. So it's a war crime, but I call it a war crime of genocidal proportions. And I can get into this a little bit if you're interested, but there's only a handful of books written about this major atrocity. But at one point when he was in the Gulag, Maslenikov was offered a chance to collaborate. And this is where I'm going to end my talk. He was with a group of people who all were desperate to get out of the camp and not starve, obviously. And they would even be fed, even armed. And some of them maybe planned to escape afterwards. But Maslenikov, in his recollections, which he wrote his whole life, he basically spent his whole life as a history teacher and wrote these memoirs, which were now published only in a 200 print run posthumously. But he wrote, humiliated and without rights in my own land, he didn't want to agree to collaborate. So at that one moment, he made a choice not to collaborate. He said, not everyone could escape, that entailed great risk. Not everyone is capable of that. So he was obviously thought himself as cautious. But then something repulsed him about joining the Germans. He said, as if that were not enough that I had ended up in captivity, now I was going to voluntarily serve them. So that choice gained him nothing but setbacks for the rest of his life. But in some ways, it was the most fateful choice that he ever made. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael. Please, Sergey.
Yes, Michael, first of all, congratulations on writing, researching and then writing really wonderful book that changes, at least changed a lot in my thinking about the period and about historiography. And I will talk about 3 themes. First of all, the relation of the book to the Feinsod's book, so Beyond Feinsod, then your focus on individual, and you presented some of the characters that you discuss in the book, and then the Stalinism and Nazism working together in your book, and I'll try to be quite short. First of all, we are dealing with a book on Smolensk, as Michael discussed, allegedly the most studied region in the Cold War historiography here in the United States. But this book is different in many ways. First of all, as Michael said, it's 98% of the archive is now available, which is a major change and major difference. It's one thing. Another thing is that it's chronologically very different. And chronology and the time, generally time in this book matters a lot, place and time, and maybe two of the main, of the key factors at least. And the time frame means that it's not just the Smolensk under the Soviet rule. In this book, it is under the Stalin rule, but it's also under Nazi rule. And it allows to look at the history of the, not just region, at the history of the entire country, the Soviet Union, through a different perspective. So this book really crosses the lines that had been established in historiography for generations. That you write an interwar history, or you write Stalinism in the 1930s, and then you write a separate book, and that would be a different author on late Stalinism and World War II in between, and that requires actually another expert and another. So there are at least three different periods that are here in one. And then there are individuals that appear here. It turns out that what we considered for so long to be very different periods of time that are supposed to be approached in a different way, with different sources, with different sort of questions, they happened not just within the lifetime of one individual, they happened within a very short period of time. And that is the writing that reminded me very much about, you already mentioned Tim Snyder, but writing about World War II experience in Poland in particular, where the discussion is about the two occupations, and that's a big story. So there is Stalinism and Nazism, but they're presented there differently. They're all occupations. And the entire narrative, most of the time, is a heroic struggle against those occupations. You do this something differently, and you also do that not just with the Soviet history, you do that with the Russian history, which is not entirely unique, but quite unique in my at least experience of reading literature on that period. Because relatively small parts of Russia were occupied, and for a relatively small period of time. So we know that Gorbachev was under occupation for a couple of weeks, and so on and so forth. Smolensk was longer. So in comparison to Ukraine, to Belarus, that's of course a much shorter period of time, and which to a degree was almost forgotten, certainly in the Soviet historiography for sure. And that focus on the individuals really allow you to do that. Then you already talked about that you are interested, of course, in the big ideologies and how the global things translate really on the local level, but there are regional and local levels. And that's new in comparison. You write about that in comparison to science, but it's also quite new and interesting for the research on the Soviet history in general. The time and place, you write about individual choices and the choices that really define the rest of your life, but also how much in that choice depends on the particular circumstances. And you already discussed here the three siblings going in different ways, in different directions. And that reminded me about research on Ukrainian history, where the one brother would be in Western Ukraine, would have a very particular trajectory in World War II history because he was recruited. He was of a certain age, oldest brother. He was recruited in the Polish army and then ended up fighting on the side of the British in Italy and so on and so forth. And then another one had a choice between going into the underground or going into the division SS. And the family decides that actually in division he would get training, he would get proper food, and in comparison to go to the forest, he goes to the division. And then the youngest brother is being in 1944, he is
Joins the partisans.
He didn't join the partisans, he joined the Red Army.
Yeah.
So the three brothers, real brothers, not invented brothers, actually in a very different, again, it's not like they completely didn't have any choices.
Right.
And your characters have these choices, but it's also
Yes.
the time and the place and the age when you were born, and would define so much.
Mhm.
And you put together here very interesting. You take Minshagin and you take also the Red Partisans. And it's almost like you read, at least in my opinion, like the parallel biographies. They're different people, but circumstances to a degree are the same. And their background different, their choices are different, but it presents you the multiplicity of the possibilities and in which the people could really participate in those events, being at the same time perpetrators and victims. And then the book is about power. And I was reading it and I was trying to understand what you mean by that, because you were talking about hard power, you're talking about soft power, then you're talking that it is really diffused, that it's not just about coercion, that it's not coming from necessarily from the top. And I finally understood that in terms of the situation in which the change of the regime is happening. The power, so to say, to use Bolshevik metaphor, is on the street. And there are people who are taking this power, or are encouraged to take this power. And the role of Minshagin and the collaborators and administration, again, it was interesting for me to read about the degree of the power that they had.
Mm-hmm.
So that is possible to go into all of that by bringing the archives, more archives than Feinsod had, different archives, but also looking at the trajectories, at the lives of these people, and then following them into post-World War II era. I have two questions maybe on the issue of this Ego documents, biographies, and then on the way of how Stalinism and Nazism work together, because you're talking about them actually sort of collaborating in a particular way in shaping the region, in shaping people's lives. So the issue about Stalinism and Nazism working together in that particular way and producing one of the crucibles, right, of power, is you're saying that this is very much defines what is happening after World War II. And my question is, this is what defines, in your opinion, for the Soviet Union in general, or the fate of the areas that were occupied, where this change of the regimes happened at least twice. In some cases, further west, it was happening more than twice, and there were more than two regimes. There is something unique about the areas that went through this sort of transformations as compared to something that would define Russian history or Soviet history for that matter. So this is the first question. And the second one is how do you deal with the memoirs and self-presentations? And there is, of course, and you worked on that as well, there is literature, huge literature on the diaries and in particular diaries under Stalin. Here we are dealing with memoirs, with people like Minshagin who went through the incarceration for a long period of time. So it's one thing to say that, okay, he had the great memory and maybe erred a little bit here and there. But once we look at this and try to match the archival materials and personal stories, what do we do with this explanation of the choice? Whether he really had a choice, or he says he didn't have a choice, or she says she didn't have any choice, but in reality, there were others. And now in this 20 years, 30, 40, 50 years later, in a completely different context, working together with the dissidents, you present yourself in a different way. So where are the limits of how far we can rely on that sort of documents? But again, thanks again. It's a fantastic work, and I was thinking that that can be a model for writing also some aspects of Ukrainian history in particular.
Thank you so much for those wonderful remarks. Do I have some time to
Yes, go ahead.
If I could have 30 minutes to respond, I would like, I'm not going to do that to you. I'm going to take a few minutes,
But
but
before you speak, let me just say, there are books for sale outside the door. You can get them either after the seminar or during it if you wish, but.
okay. So before I get to your two questions, I just want to make a few remarks in response. You mentioned Poland, and one of the kind of exceptions in that literature was Jan Gross, and his work really was important to me because he had this whole theory of the Soviet regime coming in, leading to what he called the privatization of power. It wasn't a great term for a communist regime, I don't think, but it's the same phenomenon that local zealots were kind of almost required by this regime to act in its name. And that's partly why I say the German regime as well empowered locals to terrorize people. Partly the reason they were so fearsome is because of that unpredictability of having those local emissaries involved. And also another book that was really important to me was Evgeny Finkel's book on Jewish ghettos, Ordinary Jews, which deals with even more extreme. Many of my Russian and Soviet citizens had more room for maneuver than the Jews in the ghettos, but they faced many similar choices in some ways. So that's a great book that inspired me. And so these cross-fertilization of fields. But you mentioned also like the three siblings and the Ukrainian analog. So I think that there are choices that one made that led to fateful turning points and a path to the notion of path dependency is very important. Once you decided to join the SS or join the anti-partisan units that were run by the Germans, it was very hard to change that course because then you got indoctrinated. Your units had blood on its hands. They didn't want you to escape, and they monitored you. Yes, at the end of the war, there was a window to switch to the partisans. So a lot of people actually tried to, right before the Soviets reappeared, to change their fortunes, but it wasn't that easy to do.
Gagun writes about that.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Now, in terms of power, I just think that that's the Sphinx's riddle of all, many sciences. And one common definition is power allows you to get people to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily otherwise do. That's the kind of man on the street definition. Who was that?
Robert Dow.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good one. But I mean, the problem that Feinsod wrote about power as a kind of very, he was a man who worked in the US administration during World War II. He thought of power in terms of bureaucracy and administration and management. But power, has all sorts of dimensions, right? And there's the power of ideas and beliefs. There's the power of propaganda and living in a kind of alternate universe that propaganda creates, affects you. So I tried not to kind of try to solve the Sphinx's riddle in too cut and dry a way, but to point to the many dimensions of power. But you're absolutely right that it also refers to the local, and the district level was the level of power that the Soviets could control with local officials who lived in towns. But at the very local level, this regime was incredibly weak and absent because no one wanted to live in the villages or the collective farms. And so it was a very odd regime that was so top heavy, but so, in a sense, powerless at the very bottom of the, and so in a way that explains why they overcompensate by putting all this pressure from the center. Now, you asked two questions about, I think that, the end of the book, I have an epilogue where I try to connect this down to the Putin era, the war in Ukraine, life trajectories that went past. I kind of do what I did, if you ever remember those movies where they, fill in the afterlives of the people who you watch, like Pee-wee became a big leaguer and so went on to become something or else. So I thought of it in terms of like a movie where you fill in, you've studied these characters over like the course of the entire period, but you want to know what happens to them in the end. And some of them became falsifiers of the war myth. So in terms of, the history that they themselves had witnessed, they then kind of altered to like weather vanes reflecting the later Soviet myth about World War II. So yes, in that respect, it refers to the whole Soviet Union and, certain things like the demographic cataclysms, the way the post-war regime in 45, the Reconstruction, in a sense, rebuilt the economy along the pre-war lines. These things apply to the entire Soviet Union, but the experience of the outside regime is unique to the occupied territories, the alternation of regimes. So that it's not neither one nor the other. In terms of the memoirs, yes, I didn't overburden the book with kind of source criticism, but I tried to give specialists in the endnotes the tools, because you can't always interpret these ego documents or autobiographies in the same way. But one thing I will say is that I found these documents only after years of contextual research in the archives. So instead of just looking at the texts themselves and the individuals, I was already approaching it sort of from the bottom up. And I think that that's what we can do is contextualize these documents with as many outside sources as we can. And in the case of Menshagin, he had sat in prison for 25 years, but during the Khrushchev's fall, he tried to take advantage of the amnesty. So he wrote a series of letters where he tried to get himself off. And he made essentially the same case that he did in his memoirs, that he was kind of did what he could to save people, and he never directly participated in the worst atrocities. So the ghetto, the destruction of the POWs, and he kind of dissembled and actually lied on those big points to get himself off, but to compensate and increase his veracity, he was very factual about everything else. So after reading, years about the occupation, I found his memoirs were incredibly revealing. But again, you can verify them with many other documents. And it's not only post hoc memoirs that I was dealing with, but the actual interviews. The Academy of Sciences, the Minsk Commission set up during the war. They knew it was a world historical event. They interviewed people, and the narratives about the war were not yet set. And so people talked in the middle of the war much more freely, and that's why those archives were never opened until like about 2015. And there were 70 interviews from Smolensk. And some of them were like right in 42, 43 with the partisans. And so reading all of those 70, that actually changed my entire project. That's when I knew I could actually get at people's lives. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Michael. As I mentioned before, I think that some of the very same issues come up in the recent book by Laszlo Borghi, looking at Hungary under Nazi occupation and then under Soviet occupation, the question of choices that people made. And he, in that book, among other things, tries to look at the fairly large proportion of people, significant majority, who try not to make a choice one way or the other, who either keep their heads down or basically bystanders. They may witness atrocities, but they don't really do anything about it, even though they're repulsed by it. So, and again, one thing that did strike me about this book is that the choices seem clearer to me than they may have been for a fairly large number of people, although again, it depends on who you are. And so Michael brings that out. Clearly, for example, for Jews, it's a different matter as opposed to during the Nazi occupation as it would be for others. But another thing that is something that in the book, and this was something that Sir he touched on, is one of the, again, it's inadvertently, or maybe not inadvertently, but fascinating about the book is that it relies on archives that were not available to Merle Feinsod or to others who use the Smolensk Archive, which is, as we've discussed, is a much smaller collection than is actually available, and it excludes some important institutions that were present especially during the Soviet period. So it does raise the broader question, though, about historical writing and how does it just depend on which archives you look at? Does it depend on how many of those archives? Because no individual will ever get through some collections that may number tens of millions or hundreds of millions of pages. Maybe with the advent of artificial intelligence and digitization of archives, it will become more feasible. But even then, will people really want to trust on electronic processing of archives that people may not have seen? So one of the questions that the book does raise is how you can determine how your source space affects what you're writing. Does it cause you to look for things where the street light is, you look for your keys where the street light is, or is there some way to try to get a better sense of how things actually happened for the people on the ground? That again is one thing in Witty's book. He was relying in part on letters from his own family. His own family had been a Hungarian Jewish family. And so they were writing letters that they didn't just deliberately kept concealed. And he came across these several decades later. And there too, again, it may well be that they were trying to present choices in a way that they didn't actually happen to those people at the time that events were moving. But that's one thing that I would like you, not right now, Michael, but would be to think about how you can try to get around this question of sources you use, sources to which you have access. You mentioned, for example, that there were very few, that a lot of peasants were still illiterate. Does that unnecessarily limit you to someone who was limited? Mm-hmm. And then I also finally have one very specific question, which is not related to any of that. I didn't quite understand why Menshagin was not executed. Mm-hmm. So if you could, that is, it would seem to me that the factor you cited as the reason he wasn't executed, I would cite as a reason he was almost immediately put to death. Okay, let me open it up for
the audience has been very patient, so I will bracket those questions.
And as I say, there will be books available after the seminar, so anyone who wishes to get it, Harvard University Press was a little late in setting up the table, but it is here now, so please.
Yeah, you paint a really interesting picture of the pressure people have when there's an occupation going on, and some of us might feel it now. But you have to make those choices, and I was wondering, since those were too close in time, those two occupations, were there well, there's two parts to the question. The first part is, were there characters who were activists in one and then the other, but they switched roles? In other words, could they have been an anti-Stalinist, but then collaborate with the Nazis or vice versa? And then the other thing is, like Quislings, the collaborators get treated harshly by the subsequent regime.
Yes.
So was there any attempt to rehabilitate any of those people, or were they just executed?
So this is an excellent point. I'm glad you raised the question of, what they did in both regimes, because I mentioned path dependency and how certain choices lead you down a certain path. But the force field of the two regimes, even when, they were switching, in the power vacuum of 41, they were never, it wasn't like a kind of civil war situation where they were two extremely powerful states on either side with very strong ideologies. And those two factors determined much of how people presented themselves. So let's say you went to the Germans, say, I want to work for you. You had to say, I was persecuted by the communists. I was in the Gulag. And it might not have been true. Menshagin actually was able to tell people, he was a defense lawyer, so he was very shrewd. He would see when people were lying and presenting their past in a false light. But so they reinvented their autobiographies, and there was a lot of imposture. This was a phenomenon that was rampant already under Stalinism. People changed their past, they changed their life stories. But in general, it was helpful, if you were either, the Stalinists were basically, you could do nothing for Stalin except give your life for the motherland. Nothing, if you were in captivity, you were suspect. Even if you led a resistance group in the camps or whatever, there were very few who were heroic enough to be good enough after the war. If you were ever tainted by, this is a kind of ideological xenophobia that was part of Stalinism. But in general, if you presented yourself as an opponent, right, you could get a leg up. However, both regimes were quite flexible when they needed to be. They never made law. I believe this concept of both were regimes of permanent revolution. They only made tactical compromises, unlike some other authoritarian regimes that compromise with old institutions or groups. They made only tactical compromises. But for example, despite the Commissar order, which ordered the execution of communists, many thousands of communists were allowed to serve the Germans in local positions, yet they were added over time. They were maybe some additional scrutiny and the winds shifted, but they became collaborators. And many of the propagandists actually writing in the Russian language propaganda under the occupation had worked for the Soviet press earlier with Stalinism. And so you can actually see certain themes that are taken from one regime to the other and slightly altered, but there's some interesting continuities there. Okay, so what was the second part of your question?
Was there any redemption of the collaborators? Were they all just, the next?
There was very little. Well, like someone like Menshagin was put in a regime of special, it was called regime тюрьма особого назначения. So it was like a special prison. He was so tainted that he couldn't come into any contact with anyone else except former KGB agents who were purged because they knew they would hate each other. So he was a cellmate with Suda Platov, by the way, who was a spy master for the Soviets. But, so basically the Soviets hunted down these people for decades. They never gave up. And there was almost no circumstances where you could get rid of that stigma. As for why Menshagin was not killed, yes, you're not the first to raise that question. And we don't really know because we only have his own accounts, right, of what happened when he was in the Lubyanka. But the way he presents it is that, sort of they almost forgot about him after the Nuremberg trials, because the deputy mayor of Smolensk had testified at Nuremberg about the Katyn massacre. But after that, he was kind of like languishing for several years and not being interrogated very much. And so he kind of suspected that they just didn't want someone lower level officials were too afraid to make the decision. It's to kill him, but it sounds plausible, but we actually don't know. So I think you're right to add that caveat.
Okay, please. Please.
My father, Alexander of Russia, was the veteran of Second World War. He fought Stalingrad battle.
Where specifically was he from? Where specifically?
From Belarus, from Minsk region.
Minsk.
Alexander Kostukovich. And he was only 21 years old. In his mind and in minds of millions of Soviet people, there were no choices. They were all united to fight against Nazi rule. They sacrificed 20 million people, and with that joint effort, Nazi were defeated at the Second World War, the help of the Nazis. So my question is that how strong was the resistance under Nazi occupation in Smolensk region? The big partisan fight.
I have a whole chapter on the partisans, but first let me say that there's some excellent work recently. There's a book called Stalin's Defectors about people who defected in 41, right, from the Red Army. And it was, a fairly substantial amount of people, in part because they were caught in encirclement and Stalin gave this order of no retreat. And so they knew that if they were, taken prisoner, they would face the stigma from the regime, from Stalin's regime. So, there were complicated situational factors in 41 as well, but still many people chose to defect. So the claim of a united, people against Germany was sort of a post-war construction. All sorts of things happened in the midst of World War II. There were marauders in the Smolensk countryside that included both German defectors and local partisans who had sort of descended into marauding and looting. And all partisans lived off the land. The Soviet policy was to support them with weapons, but not with any food or supplies. So there was a kind of civil war happening in the countryside. Some villages supported the Germans, and the Germans gave them material incentives. Other villages supported, the Soviets, but they often switched. So it was it was almost like the Civil War after the Revolution. So it was very complicated depending on what factors were going on in any given district. But I would say that, for example, when the Germans started conscripting these Eastern laborers by essentially abducting them from the countryside, even the local armed collaborators who were working for the Germans sometimes refused to do that. Young women, young people so there were limits to what both sides would do. But many of the partisans didn't, contrary, this is why this book will never be translated into Russian in part, but the chapter on the partisans itself, commits too many transgressions against the myth, but many of them simply engaged in a reign of terror against the local populations and didn't do much against the Germans, who were far superior fighting forces. So they sat out the war in the countryside. They had their own forest camps. It was almost like a subculture. But in general, the peasantry was not known for its resistance. And so the urban population of Smolensk region is less than 15%. And so the rural population, and as Mark is saying, there's a vast majority of people who simply are opportunistic. They've never had taken a stance. They want to take whatever stance is more advantageous, and yet the fortunes of war keep shifting. And so it seems like at first the Germans are going to win, then it seems the opposite. And so you're so close to the front lines that these shifts in the fortunes of war can actually be seen as kind of a seismograph for determining the attitudes of local populations.
That just, I can't keep thinking this over and over again when you say about how they shift. Because that's what's happening under Trump. You look at Rubio and some of these people, that's exactly what they're
Okay,
doing.
that's a topic for a different.
I know, but
Let me just add here, just to what Michael has said, is there was some excellent work done in the Russian Federation in the 1990s on collaboration during, the relatively much more limited occupation of Russian territory. But there was as they showed quite convincingly, these were studies put out by the Yakovlev Foundation, was that the rate of collaboration there was just as high as elsewhere. So all of the accusations that were later made about particular groups, particularly some of the groups that Stalin deported en masse during the war.
Absolutely. So the Russians, even during the war, Stalin played the Russian national card very strongly. During the war, rehabilitated the Orthodox Church. Even Vlasov who was a Russian general who defected, was given less attention in the Soviet press. And that's why, non-Russians were associated with collaboration and the ethnic Russians were not. But in fact, the largest group of collaborators were ethnic Russians simply because they were the largest part of the Soviet population and the largest part of the Red Army. However, there's an added nuance, which is that Hitler and the Germans saw the Russians as the lowest on the racial totem pole. So Belarusians were better and Ukrainians were even better. And so many switched, and I talked about imposture and dissembling, they called themselves Ukrainians, and even local commanders worked against the Führer, which is opposite of Ian Kershaw's famous phrase of working towards the Führer. But on the ground, on the Eastern Front, they needed manpower, and so they simply reclassified them as Cossacks, as Belarusians, as Ukrainians, but they were really, local Russian. So this and the Soviets were not actually aware of that. That's one fact that I was able to establish. And so some of the that's one connection between what we're seeing today. So 7 decades later, when Ukrainians are called Nazis, right? And the whole phenomenon of collaboration on the Russian territories is sort of obfuscated. But I'll say another word about Comrade Trump, if I may, because I don't think there's a direct analogy that these regimes are, in the 21st century, you don't need mass murder to control populations. In a sense, political violence is a sign of, in a certain sense, not of weakness, but of incapacity. State capacity is not enough for regimes to get what they want to get. And now you have the internet and disinformation in ways that you can avoid perhaps mass violence. We'll see. But I do think that I start the book with a quotation from the famous historian Mark Bloch, who says, the past, doesn't only influence the present, but the present influences the past. So the period that we're living through, I think this period speaks to us in different ways. And in my field, everyone kind of wanted to be a friend of the people. Workers and peasants could do no wrong because they would always resist power, and they wanted to, I'm caricaturing a lot, but this was sort of, this notion that, of looking of the old social history that was done at a certain time. I'm simplifying and caricaturing, but what I was much more attuned to is how people want to use these changes as opportunities for themselves. And I think that's, in a way, how that speaks to us now.
Just also on the question of Russian collaboration in Russia today, for 12 years now, it's been illegal in Russia to acknowledge the fact of occupation in Russia during the war. There was a law adopted in May of 2013 that basically said that any interpretation that deviates from the official view of the war and justifies Nazism, which is the equivalent made in the law, is illegal. So, and there have been people prosecuted.
Well, I'll say one more thing. Not deciding is also a choice. So if you decide not to do anything, in a sense, you're making a choice. And that's what, so the weakness of institutions, of civil society, of religious organizations, the whole history of Stalinism, it left people without recourse except for their local networks. And some people still did what they thought was ethical and made moral choices, even under those conditions. So, but the situation that is in a society that does have a press, a civil society, strong institutions, is very different from what people faced in 41.
Yeah.
Okay, other questions? I will say that some of what Menshagin did to justify his behavior reminded me of some of those in the Soviet Academy who tried to, or claimed that they had tried to keep people from harm, but actually did go along the whole time, making their careers, advancing in their careers and so forth. But did, or at least claimed, for example, when Sakharov was denounced in 1975, they didn't defend him or try to in some ways convince the Soviet regime to withdraw it, but said that they hadn't gone along with the harshest measures. And then that was the excuse made, for example, by what's his name, who was the head of the academy at the time.
Alexander?
Right, Alexander. Please, Craig.
That's one of Pavel's themes, of course. Say I was trying to reform it from the inside. But coming back to Menshagin, you characterize him as a technocrat as opposed to an ideologue. And you talk a fair amount about the need and to encourage people locally to collaborate in order for the regime, so in this case, the Nazis, to be able to control such a vast region, albeit only 15% is probably what they had to focus on because the countryside is more or less quiescent. So how, when you're surveying who is working for the Germans, can you give us a general sense of how many were people who could be considered to be technocrats who have simply continued running the water system or whatever it may be, in this case, the mayoralty of the town, and how many didn't have a role in under the old system and offered themselves up and had the talent and the abilities to actually do the job as well?
So I would make a distinction between the people who were in the local, what they called civilian administrations, because there the Germans' proclivities were to recruit from the local non-party intelligentsia. So people from universities, from local lawyers, people who were literate, knew bureaucracy, could sit in a chancellery and do things. So that was their proclivity, and that's in fact what they ended up with, at least in the Russian RSFSR occupied territories, about which I read quite a bit about beyond Smolensk as well. So local intelligentsia groups, which had been, hit pretty hard under Stalinism, and all elites were hit disproportionately under the Great Terror. And also they were very doubtful that they would be in the good graces of the regime, even if Soviet power came back the next day, if they had just remained and they hadn't fled or served the Red Army just by being there. So they were already sort of inclined to go in that direction. And then there were, certain types of like agronomists and foresters who had in a rural area had like great skills, but they were increasingly, all of them were treated, as Untermenschen, as subhumans. And as the Germans began to lose the war, they changed their policy on Russians, and they tried to kind of win hearts and minds. There were lots of proposals going on I treat this extensively, and it's a kind of untold story because the locals were in dialogue with these elements of the German occupation that wanted to find, they knew they were going to lose the war if they didn't find a way out. And Hitler and the people in Berlin constantly said, no, we're not going to give you a protectorate. We're not going to give you any political hope for the future. You are simply going to be slaves of the Reich. But, you know, so there was a lot of contradictions going on, but, you know, the local, say, agronomists or veterinarians were whipped by the Germans. They reintroduced what had been abolished in 1970. They were subject to corporal punishment. So there was the factor of humiliation, local doctors as well, nurses, school teachers. So they, you know, many of whom were women. And so, you know, in about the course of the first year, there was a significant shift from welcoming the Germans, hoping it would be better, the peasantry often welcoming them with bread and salt, and then, you know, a real shift. And the peasantry is essentially powerless, but it's so big that when millions of people change their minds, it can have a big effect. And so the German occupation regime started actually reporting these things, and as soon as the population could, they would sort of turn against the Germans. And we have all their local, I had many of their local reports, which I think added a whole significant dimension to the book. So I guess I'll stop there. This may be time for.
Sir, did you want to?
No.
Please, one last question.
I'm reminded in these situations, Bertrand Russell said, at what point in starvation would you trade the right to vote for a bag of rice?
Mhm.
And you talked about the peasantry, and the people are having to make these decisions of what to do now, and that's this crucible. And did you run across any person's eloquent description of the thought process they were going through to either do nothing, to collaborate, to resist, or just try to, I mean, there's so many parameters in that decision. Did anybody put it very eloquently?
Well, this relates to Mark's question about the sources sort of determining what we can write about. And most peasants don't leave introspective memoirs at all. But I think that there's also a book about the blockade of Leningrad by Alexis Perry, published by Harvard as well, which is based on intelligentsia diaries. It's an incredible book because it has people were starving during the blockade and writing almost incredible, with incredible depth about their experience. I didn't have access to too many of those types of sources, but every character that I included had some kind of significant autobiographical statements that illuminated their lives. That's why I selected them. And I selected them also because they represent major portions of the population. So, like, for example, we know, for example, with peasants, like someone like Maslenikov, his immediate choice was to return to his family. Family is something that is not often represented in a lot of the historical sources which are created by the state, but which is determinative of ordinary people's choices. And in fact, I'll just end with this last, well, I'll just say two more things before we end. One was about Merle Feinsod not having access to documents from high levels like the secret police, Politburo, Central Committee. He had the local and regional, district and regional levels were especially well represented in the Smolensk Archive. So he was able to talk about all the chaos and improvisation at those levels. But when it came to the center, he saw kind of totalitarian, top-down, total control. But it's only because he didn't have access to that whole dimension too. So I think that in some ways, not having the sources does determine your focus. But using several different fields in a way is a cushion against that. And in Holocaust studies, there's the notion of choiceless choice. It's a famous concept that was debated in Holocaust. If you're facing extermination, you're facing starvation and death, you still can make choices, but they're hopeless, they're choiceless. It's not going to change your future anyway. And I found that, there's a continuum there where people have different types of agency. So, I think that Menshagin, to end on this point, and his personal life, before the Germans invaded in 41, I found this out only after years of studying him. He started an affair with a woman who was a wife of a client. He was a lawyer, and they had a child. So he was essentially involved in a bigamous relationship. And he was a believer, an Orthodox believer, and he was a lawyer. So this was something he never talked about for the rest of his life. But when the Germans came, he basically got rid of his first wife and adopted the daughter and married the second. And, that in a way was a factor in him deciding to stay in occupied Smolensk, to make that personal switch in his life. Now, how do we weight that? As historians, we can say what we can, and we have to acknowledge that we don't know everything.
That sounds like a determining factor. Michael, Siri, yeah.
It is in the book and something that I don't think was part of the discussion, that there were also conscious ideological choices.
Yes.
To join the Nazi regime and administration, and Oleg Budnitsky has this
right, absolutely. You're absolutely right.
And you have a chapter on the syndicalists and Russian question and Vlasov. So there was Russian nationalism and anti-Stalinism as part of that. So apart from all these others that we discussed, there was also a conscious ideological choice.
So
either anti-Stalinist or pro-Nazi.
So I believe that ideology is not just like a separate factor, a doctrine. It's constantly interacting with all these other elements, but you cannot study this whole region without studying ideas and political commitments either. So, I think that a lot of times it's exaggerated, the power of it's called an ideological war, but on the local level, it was maybe sometimes not even determinative, but it's always in the background and can never be kind of discounted.
Yeah, there's an interesting book I was looking at a few years ago about Korea and China under Japanese occupation. And some of these same issues you're talking about, first of all, some of the ideological choices, especially those who were communists in China and others. But a lot of the people, though, that was mostly the milieu in which they were operating, that instead they were making some of the same choices. It was the high rate of occupation in China, in Korea, which you would never know about listening to the versions that have been put forth in both of those countries over the last several decades. So in any case, some of these same issues that Michael has touched on in the book come up in many historical circumstances, and that's one of the reasons I think that you can really find it a rich and illuminating book to read, not just for this particular case, although the case itself is very interesting. So with that, let me thank Michael, Serhi, everyone for coming, and please get a hold of the book outside.
My colleague, Arlene Rothko, wrote a book called